Gender differences was the topic of this panel from the Virginia Festival of the Book in Charlottesville, with authors Stephen Rhoads and Andrea Buchanan. This lasts about an hour.
My name is Caplan, and on behalf of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, which produces the Virginia Festival of the Book, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's program, Gender Differences, How Significant Are They? I would also like to remind you that there are evaluation forms. We would appreciate it very much if you would fill them out and hand them to the representatives of the Book Festival in the back of the room when you leave the program today. The Virginia Festival of the Book is an annual event which promotes literacy and celebrates books. The festival emphasizes programs both in schools and in festival venues that are, with few exceptions, free of charge. This festival would not be possible without the help of several hundred volunteers, whom we thank for their efforts. Another way you can help the festival is, as I mentioned, by filling out the evaluation. It's real important to them. Hundreds of businesses and individuals have made in-kind and monetary donations, and if you would like to join them in supporting the festival, please stop by the Virginia Book Information Desk at the Omni Hotel, or mail a donation to the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, which is at 145 Edmund Drive in Charlottesville. Okay. Now I would like to introduce our two panelists today, and I'll apologize in advance. I seem to be coming down with one of the whatever they are that are going around Charlottesville at the moment. Our two speakers today are Steven E. Rhoads, author of Taking Sex Differences Seriously, and Andrea Buchanan, author of Mother Shock and Other Books. And I would like to introduce both of them at the beginning, and then we will start with Professor Rhoads and then with Ms. Buchanan. Steven E. Rhoads, author of Taking Sex Differences Seriously, has been a professor teaching public policy at UVA for 30 years. These courses include political economics and a course titled Sex Differences, Biology, Culture, and Policy. He's the author of numerous articles and other books, including Incomparable Worth, Pay Equity Meets the Market. He focuses his studies on sex differences and their importance for an understanding of many contemporary cultural, gender, and policy issues. Professor Rhoads writes for the National Review, among other national publications, and his book has been lauded by many conservatives, such as Laura Schlesinger and Christina Hoff Sommers, some of whom you may be familiar with, for its reification of women's and men's traditional roles in nuclear families. To my left is Andrea Buchanan, who is the author of Mother Shock, managing editor of LiteraryMama.com, and is editor of the forthcoming anthologies It's a Boy and It's a Girl. Mother Shock was described by Big Apple parent as potently honest. Buchanan's capacity for self-reflection paves the path for all mothers to explore the complex feelings that accompany motherhood. And the Library Journal remarked, as she repeatedly points out, it is not choosing breast milk over formula that makes one a good mother. It is the ability to accept that every new mother can only do the best that she can. She has 3 anthologies forthcoming from Seal Press: Literary Mama, the best writing from the literary magazine LiteraryMama.com in January 2006. It's a Boy, Women Writers on Raising Sons, coming out in October 2005. And It's a Girl, Women Writers on Raising Daughters, coming out in spring 2006. So with those introductions, I would like to pass the chair over to Professor Rhoads.
Well, thank you, Claire. Let me say at the start, I don't want to lose half my audience. That although I write for the National Review, I've also written for the New York Times and the LA Times, and I do find that the typical student in my class on sex differences is female and left of center, and they think they learned something. So I hope you'll keep an open mind as we proceed here. My argument is that sex differences are deep and consequential, and that we'd have a better culture and a better policy and get along better if we recognize that. Different kinds of evidence, but let me just mention a couple at the start that convince me of this, that there's a biological base to some degree, for gender roles. First, in the first day of life, little baby girls and little baby boys are different. If you play a recording of another baby crying, little baby, they both cry. Newborns both cry, but the little baby girls cry longer. And, you know, what is this? Maybe it's a sign of kind of empathy that they come out with that's a little greater. If you put a picture of a human face in front of a newborn girl and a newborn boy, and then also put a picture of what the experimenters called the alien, which is more or less oval, but it has geometric forms coming out and you know, things flapping from the chin, and the little girls look more at the human, and the little boys look more at the alien. If somebody talks to the kid, the little girls look a real human being. This is at 4 months. The little girls look longer, and the little boys, doesn't make any difference whether they're talking or not. They're just going to look a certain amount of time. And so other reasons why I think this goes deep is that hormones, prenatal hormones, seem to have an effect. For example, women, we have ways of measuring this, but women who are exposed to more testosterone in the womb, yes, thank you, or exposed to more testosterone in the womb, end up somewhat more on personality scales and other ways that men and women tend to differ toward men, more androgynous. They are more career-oriented. They're less baby and doll-oriented. Dolls when young, babies when older. They're more interested in sex. They're more assertive than women who have been exposed to average levels of testosterone or low levels. The three areas I want to look particularly at are, briefly, because I love questions most of all, are aggression and competitiveness, sexuality, and nurturing the young. And aggression, we got a real problem, and it's mainly a male problem. There's 28 men worldwide who kill another man for every woman who kills another woman. And males are more aggressive by the age of 13 months. And what I think we have to do about it, briefly, is get them married off. There is clear evidence that when men get married, they become less aggressive. And even evidence that, since testosterone is linked to aggression, evidence that their testosterone levels go down when they get married. The testosterone levels go down again when they have kids in marriage. The other thing I mentioned is sports, and this is where I get into policy here. I do think that Title IX, one unfortunate side of it is it's you know, when trying to balance budgets, as women get more teams, men are getting fewer teams. And think of something like wrestling. Wrestlers are tough kids, and we're losing 60 or some, have lost 60 or some wrestling teams. Probably a mistake, I would argue, if you're concerned about male aggression. We do know that the male aggression is growing in unsupervised peer groups of young males. So I say let's let them show how tough they are in a supervised environment with rules. Then I talk about sex, and sex is controlled in substantial degree by testosterone. Men are more interested in sex. Men are more interested in sex with a variety of partners. I could give you some data on that, but let me just remind you what we tell men and women these days. If you look at Friends and Sex and the City, I think you don't get the sense that it's much different, this casual sex business, for men than it is for women. And I think that doesn't go along with the evidence. The evidence is, for example, you just look at disease, that sleeping one time with a infected partner, you're 8 times more likely to become infected with HIV if you're a woman than you are a man. My brightest students, most of them haven't heard this, the females. Casual sex, I think, is less attractive to women than to men. Most women say they looked at sex as a way to share emotions and love. Men, it's much more sexual gratification or sexual release. These differences lead to a lot of pain, I would argue, for young women. 71% of teenage girls report being in love with their last partner. 45% of teenage boys say they were in love with their last partner. Teen girls are much more likely to say they regret their experiences to date. And a particularly interesting study, because it looked at women who'd had a lot of experience with casual sex. And you'd think they would be the ones who report they like it the most. But he surveyed 250 and then found the women and the men who'd had the most sexual partners, and found every one of the 5 women who'd had the most sexual partners was now turned off by casual sex. They were assertive, they were interested in male careers, they couldn't understand it, they still believed there was nothing the matter with it, but their feelings refused to cooperate with their beliefs. And so anyway, I think one of the reasons that we now have 29% of 40-year-old women unmarried, and in 1960 we had 13%, is because men are getting a lot of sex without marriage. And so on to a happier subject, and that is women and nurturing. I do think that hormones help explain why women are better nurturers of the young. Testosterone is a turnoff for nurturing, actually. Again, high testosterone women, less interested in babies. Low testosterone women, in fact, no testosterone women. There are women who have a condition called Turner's syndrome. They have no testosterone, unusually interested in babies, really interested in dolls, much more so even than most women. What helps nurturing is estrogen and oxytocin, especially a nurturing hormone, which women have more neural receptors for it, and they also get more of them when they become pregnant. So mothers more than fathers enjoy childcare, especially with young babies, toddlers. One sign of this is fathers tend to do just the fun things. They tend to read and play with the kid. Mother does everything. But if you ask mothers and fathers how much they like parenting, mothers say they like it more than fathers. Even if you go to Sweden, where there's been such an emphasis on androgynous gender roles and trying to make men and women have more or less identical lives, laws such as saying we have a parental leave policy, but 4 weeks of it has to be taken by the man, otherwise the family loses it entirely, paid leave. So anyway, in Sweden you go and you look at families where the father is about to have a kid, says, I want to be the principal caretaker of this child. And then they send researchers into those families and find that, that in those families, the mothers display affectionate behavior, vocalize, smile, tend, hold, and soothe the infant more than the fathers do. On a 10-point scale, if you ask mothers what's important to their happiness, and part of my argument is that I think women are really into relationships. From the very start, they have best friends. Boys tend to travel in packs. They share all their experiences with these best friends. When you go through puberty, when women get more estrogen, they become more interested in people. When boys go through puberty, get more testosterone, they become more loners. So women are really interested in these relationships, especially relationships with their kids, and I think 86% of women on a scale of 1 to 10 of mothers say how important to your happiness is your kid, say it's a 10. 30%, if they work, say that about their job. So I would argue that we shouldn't push women into doing what I think often happens, and that is they become very anxious as well as guilty when they're away from young kids. I don't think there are many mothers with one-year-olds who enjoy working 50 hours a week, or at least enjoy in the way a man can, because the evidence suggests that men can put on hold their parenting in a way that women can't. They're always kind of worried that something's going to go wrong. I see I'm nearing the end of where I should speak, I think. But I do think, let me just end with a final statement, but before that, an anecdote, which I think is important, and it shows how tough some of these decisions are for really talented women. Because, and they really are, and there's some really moving stories, I think, anecdotes in my book, as well as cartoons. It's not just all studies, despite what it sound like here. But the anecdote that I think impressed me most was by Madeline Kunin, who's was a governor of Vermont for a couple terms. She had 4 young kids while she was governor. And she writes an autobiography. And in the autobiography, she says, at least once a day, I would feel a stab in my chest, thinking I should be at one place when I was at another. There was no cure for the anxiety. All I could do was not to let it overwhelm me, not to let it pull me down. I think there are multiple studies that show the stresses of, even when you have a supportive spouse, and even when your kid is not young, but even he's a teenager, that there's more stress, more cortisol, stress hormone, in mothers at work than there are fathers at work. So what I come away with is the view, not that dads shouldn't do anything. They're terribly important. We can talk about that if you like. But that we aren't doing women especially any favors if we make them think that they should rush back to careers if there's something in them that tells me I should spend this time with my kid. I don't think, since we're not made the same way, if men and women do everything equally, you're not going to get equal happiness. Because women are going to have these stresses when at work, for example, that men are not going to have. So let me stop there.
Well, I almost don't know where to begin with this. Let me start out by talking a little bit about my books, and then perhaps I'll dive in. My first book, Mother Shock, which you can see here. Sure. My first book, Mother Shock, is about the culture shock of new motherhood. And I posit that motherhood is not something that is entirely instinctual to women, and that in fact it involves a cycle of adjustment, much like that experienced by a traveler when they go to a new country. And I believe that the adjustment to motherhood is not a transition that women are more specialized and equipped for than men. What I'm concerned about, listening to these kinds of facts, are generalizations that we extrapolate to all women. And what I traffic in my books, in Mother Shock and in the upcoming It's a Boy and It's a Girl, are specifics. Actual mothers, actual stories about why they are torn between work and motherhood and what they feel in raising boys and raising girls. I'll talk a little bit about how these two books came about. I wrote my first book, actually, when I was pregnant with my son. I had a daughter already. And when I was pregnant with my son, a lot of people asked me what I was going to have. In fact, the most popular question any pregnant woman is asked, aside from when are you due, has got to be, are you having a girl or a boy? I was really surprised by the reaction I got when I told people I was having a son, because I wanted to have a girl, another daughter. But people were very excited for me when I said I was having a boy. They would say, you must be so happy, as if I wouldn't be happy if I was having a girl. Or they would say, your husband must be so proud, as if he'd be disappointed if we weren't having a son. Countless people told me how special boys were, how much easier they were, how much better they were than girls. And most often they would tell me this right in front of my then 3-year-old daughter. This really surprised me. Being a mother to a daughter felt natural to me. I was a daughter, or I am a daughter. I am a mother, I have a girl. This was something I could understand. But having a boy seemed something foreign, and I couldn't understand the excitement of all these strangers who were so eager to comment on it. As I contemplated these feelings, I exchanged emails with a lot of other writers who I know who are also mothers, and we talked about this. I asked the following questions. Are there differences between mothering a son and mothering a daughter? Are the ideas that we have about boys and girls based on real differences between them? Or do our ideas about the differences, in fact, inform their behavior? Do boys really love their mothers differently? Are girls really difficult? Are boys really easy? And do these stereotypes about boy and girl babies change in toddlerhood and adolescence? The conversation this sparked in me an idea for organizing a collection of essays. And that's what I've done. I've put together these 2 books about raising boys and raising girls. The It's a Boy submissions have been very interesting to read, especially as I now have a 2.5-year-old son, and I have my own nurture versus nature experiment playing out on a daily basis in my home. I've had essays about ambivalence about having a boy, which is what I felt at first. I've had essays about mothers of teenagers and how that transition is going in their own home. I've had essays about boys and violence, boys subverting gender expectations, boys who like to wear pink, boys who like to play dress up, boys who like to wear dresses. And a lot of essays about the very specific otherness of boys and how these mothers try to relate to boys as feminists themselves, or as women who grew up with with sisters or other girls in the family. What I'm interested in investigating in the It's a Boy and It's a Girl books is how dynamic and multifaceted and highly personal the notion of gender is. Because I don't think that we can extrapolate so easily. I don't think we can say, well, my son likes to play with trucks and he's going to grow up and be a scientist, or my daughter likes to play with dresses and she'll be a performer. I don't think we can take these individual behaviors that change sometimes on a daily basis and make judgments about the kind of people they will be, or even about the kind of people that we know, just women and men in our own lives. I would also submit that perhaps one of the reasons why you mentioned women talk about feeling so content with motherhood as opposed to career choices is that women are encouraged to feel content about motherhood and discouraged to feel content about making choices to have a career. For a lot of women, it's a very fraught subject, but I don't think it's just because we're nurturers and we like to change diapers. I think it's because it's a very difficult choice that women are not encouraged to come out and say, I would rather be working 40 hours a week than at home playing Thomas the Tank Engine with my son. You're not going to be very popular as a mother if you say that. And believe me, there's quite a stigma about being the bad mother in our culture, especially right now when there's a lot of focus on hyperparenting and women opting out. I think that just talking about sex differences as an explanation for the kind of choices that men and women make, especially as parents, is missing a huge part of the picture, which is the way that our work and our culture structures work, the way our companies structure work. If women don't have access to decently paid, flexible work, of course they're going to feel conflicted if they have to be away from their children, if they're trying to balance one and the other. I think I'll stop there for now, because I could go on.
Thank you. Maybe at this point, why don't we open it up to the audience, and also if you wish to respond to one another. And I want to mention that if you have a question for the panelists, if you would use the microphone that's right in the center of the room, it's real important because this is being taped by C-SPAN, so no one will hear you if you don't speak into the microphone. So, any questions? It's a few steps back from you, behind the gentleman in the tweed coat.
Dr. Rhoads, in terms of the factors of research, there are many factors that are involved in research which people don't understand. They read the statistical data and the end results, but they don't take into account, for example, the gender of the researcher, the cultural bias of the researcher, how it's driven by grants from major corporations who have a personal agenda. For example, you talked about Sweden, and I lived in Sweden, and my experiential circumstances led me to be with those kinds of families, and I found it totally different. You talked about aggression, and the NIH did a study. I started to write all the statistics and the research that contradicted the things that you said. The NIH did a 25-year study on 40 countries on the roots of violence and determined that bonding and affection were much more important than food for those people. So that, and the Institute of Heart Math in Boulder Creek, California, did a research study on the effects of the environment on the DNA. Indigenous cultures who have a matriarchal society extrapolate different information from patriarchal. So how can you render that research, in fact, gives us the kind of information that we need to deal with when there are, I'm sure, many women in this room who can tell you that gender bias is prevalent. As a matter of fact, if you look on the Virginia Festival of the Book, you will see that the scientific panels are all male.
Well, there's two possible explanations for that. I appreciate the question. I would say, let me just go over the question of prenatal testosterone, because I think it's one of the few studies that looks at both that and at socialization variables. This is a guy, Richard Udry, a big shot, got a lot of NIH grants, as a matter of fact. But on the whole, people who do this research, he's one of them, say, I can't get research to do a follow-on study for the one I'm about to tell you on. The only time I've been rejected 3 times. I'm a past president of the American Population of Demographers, and nobody wants to touch it. But here's what he found. He found 25-year-old blood samples that were taken from the uterus of mothers when they were pregnant with babies, baby girls, and measured the amount of testosterone in those blood samples. And then this was a study of an HMO, and they'd done a little bit about how these girls had been raised along the way, but he repeated it. He asked the mothers and the daughters, did your parents tend to encourage you to play with dolls, to dress, to cook in the kitchen and so on? Or did they encourage you to fix things and play sports? And so all these variables were worked in. And of course, these are girls who nobody knows which have more testosterone than the other in the womb. They're all being raised in the same culture, same media signals about how they should end up being and how boys should be and girls should be. And the girls who are exposed to more testosterone are simply, in some sense, less feminine, more androgynous, more interested in careers, less interested in babies, and more interested in sex, the things I mentioned along the way, than the others. They were raised in the similar cultures. So I think this is pretty powerful. There's also the evidence of terribly tragic stuff of parents who were encouraged by people who think that it's socially constructed. And what happens sometimes is boys are born without penises. So what do you do? So for a while, there's some expert at Johns Hopkins who said, chop off their testicles and we make them a little girl, they'll never know the difference. So they studied 25 of these kids who've not only been raised as little girls, put in dresses and everything, but they've also been shot full of estrogen and testosterone-blocking hormones. And they find every one of the 25 loves rough and tumble play the way boys usually do and girls don't. 13 of these poor kids, who are now 5 to 14, have already told their poor parents that they are boys. They've been raised as girls. They are boys. They don't say, I want to be a boy. They say, I'm a boy. And in one case, the book written by a whole book on this, as Nature Made Him, they go through the details. They put a dress on him, he tears it off. You give him a rope, he instead of jumping rope with it, he whips people with it. Goes on the playground, he's terribly dominating in the way men tend to be. So these are kids who've been raised a certain way. So I think that what we need to do is to have more of these sorts of studies where we're looking at biology and at socialization. And remember, the most important kind of biology is prenatal. It isn't going to tell us nearly as much to measure testosterone levels in adult women or men.
Also for Dr. Rhoads, you're a brave man, Stephen, even if you are tenured. I respect that. One of the depressing things about gender studies is that no one seems to look at the power relationships. There are many ways in which women have a lot more power than men. Women control the sexual transaction, they own the children, they have the pandering support of the media, the government, this university, just about every institution. Does your book look at those issues? I think we could understand an awful lot more on this subject if we got past some of the ideology and looked at the facts on the ground. Who has the power, and what are the consequences of that? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think it depends what we mean by power, first of all, and I do think here's a big difference right off the bat. If you look cross-culturally, how they like to be described, women and men, women tend to say empathetic, nurturing, men tend to say independent, assertive. But that doesn't mean women don't have any power, because as one woman put it, we're the ones who I forget exactly how it's put, who create the relationships, who bind the societies, who build the connection that makes life worthwhile. And so that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer, I think, is to look at what men and women want in marital relationships. And I thought I'd get more trouble than I did by mentioning all the feminists, Mary Wollstonecraft and Simone de Beauvoir, who seemed to like dominant men who didn't treat them all that well. And this seems to be something that women don't necessarily want men who are just equal with them. Maybe equal's fine, but a little bit better, a little bit higher status seems to be more attractive romantically. If you look within marriages, you see that where women do make most of the decisions, the evidence I've seen suggests these are very unhappy marriages. Who's the most unhappy people in them? The women. Overwhelmingly the women. They're getting their way, but they're unhappy. Well, you can probably imagine what's happening. If they're getting their way all the time, the guy's tuning out, going to watch the game. That's not what she wants. And anyway, this is what the evidence shows, that these are very, very unhappy marriages. So anyway, that would be my quick take on it.
I just need to jump in here really quick. I think it's dangerous to talk about evidence and facts about this sort of thing and declare one side ideological and one side factual and scientific when actually this is not a scientific book. This is an ideological book. You're talking about facts. Sure, but all of these facts are subject to interpretation. There's still somebody interpreting these facts who has his own preconceived notions about what men and women do. And we can talk all you want about testosterone prenatally and stuff, but to extrapolate from there and conflate that with a woman who wants to have a career as being somehow not a woman or not maternal or more man-like is just silly. There's a range of human experience that men and women have, and I think to put women in little boxes and put men in these other boxes does a disservice to all of us. I mean, speaking in terms of motherhood and having power, media, pandering, I don't see any of that at all. Mothers are very constrained. All the stuff about motherhood in the media recently is because mothers are trying to figure out how to do with this stuff without the support of a culture that really wants us to keep monitoring each other and picking on each other and judging each other. If we were all able to talk about this together, maybe we actually would be able to make some progress in terms of getting paid for the kind of work we do. But the longer we talk about these kinds of things as being men's domain and women's domain, the longer this sort of problem is going to happen. I think men lose out when they believe that they can't be nurturers. And I think women lose out when they believe that men can't be nurturers either. Right now, my husband is taking care of my children, and I believe he's doing an excellent job. I believe, in fact, that the more men do these kinds of things, the more they see that it's not something that is a specialized skill. I believe that my husband and I both went into parenthood with being equally clueless, and I maybe scaled the learning curve faster because I was the one to do it. But I don't doubt his capabilities in trying to do that himself. And I think we underestimate men when we do that, and I think we do disservice to women as well.
I think there are some innate things. I also agree with what you just said. I'll be 88 in a few months, and I've been around a long time and made many observations. When I was in my teens, people would sometimes say to me as a put-down, "You think like a boy." When I started learning some of what you were saying, I realized I do. I'm analytical. So in that respect, they were right, because that's the way men are classified, as being analytical. I made a list of some things while you were talking, because I picked up a few new ones. I'm not aggressive, but I'm assertive. There is a difference. You don't get away with much around me. I'm not physical about it. It's verbal. I raised 2 daughters by myself, and thank goodness they were girls, after their father took off with somebody else. And my mother, I learned a great deal of my mother, who I think had somewhat more of the masculine traits. I mean, I hadn't thought about that before. I thought about it while you were talking. To me, motherhood wasn't a goal in and of itself, but I was so glad I had daughters and not sons, because I would have had a much more difficult time. But I love to learn things, and undergraduate something else, but in graduate school, I majored in real hard sciences. And then I couldn't get a job in that. It was something else. I got a related job, so I did all right. I worked down by the mall in Washington at the Department of Agriculture. I lived way the heck out in Maryland where I could afford it. I had someone in the house to sort of look after things and incidentally clean the house while they were there. But I always came home for dinner because I wanted to know what was going on in my daughter's lives. And I cooked the dinner because I like to cook. And I organized that very well. I still do. I'm I'm very capable at organizing things, which is supposed to be more masculine. And I realized that, while you were talking, one of my daughters is more like me in some of this, and the other one is more like her father, who was disorganized. I did the organization when we were together. So I think, you may be correct about the effect of the testosterone. I hadn't heard that one before. But I think there are women who have the characteristics that you were listing as male, because I think I'm one of them.
Well, thank you. I do think that I'm pleased that you didn't feel threatened by what I said, because if you look up the book on Amazon.com, you'll find a note from a high testosterone woman. She says, I was tested for it because I'm having a lot of miscarriages, and they wondered. And I know I'm high testosterone, but I finally realized why I'm not like so many other women, because the way most women are just seems ridiculous to me. And I think part of this is hormonal. And one sign of this, I think, if you look at Naomi Wolf, a good feminist, when she writes in Misconceptions, and how she changed, and how things that she used to look at parenting magazines and what sap it seemed like, and now it made sense. Anyway, I would say only this. One reason I think that taking sex difference seriously will help women, and I appreciate, first of all, a couple of things, what Andrea said. First of all, I'm struck by the fact the number of times in your book you use the word anxiety, anxious.
Others are anxious.
I don't think that's all socially constructed. You went to when your husband said, I'll take care of the kid, you go to a movie, you report that you worried about your kid the whole time. This is the movie when you're writing this little note to your daughter. But anyway, I don't think biology's all what tells mothers it's wonderful, although oxytocin does really help. It also tells them, in a way, worry, because if you worry through eons, generation after generation after generation, mothers who worried when they hadn't seen their babies for 10 hours were more successful getting their
right, and fathers don't have to worry because mothers are doing that for them. This is a culturally constructed thing. I think if fathers were more involved, as many fathers are, I know a lot of fathers who call themselves co-parents. They don't call it babysitting. They're actively involved. When fathers are more involved and do the kinds of things that mothers do, they worry just as much. It's not about mothers being worriers. It's about mothers being in charge of that division of labor. And actually, I think you brought up an important point about being better at certain things. I don't think that marriages have to be divided, and parenting has to be divided down gender lines. I think that people have to do what they're better at. If my husband is better at waking up 5 times in the middle of the night and falling back asleep again, he's the one who does the night shifts with the baby. If I'm better at getting the kids off to school in the morning, that's what I do. But we don't divide it up in terms of, who's going to make the bed and clean the dishes because she's the woman, and he's going to go out and do this because he's the man. I think it makes more sense to divide it up at what your proclivities are, what you're naturally good at. And I think if both people are doing it, then they're both challenged to find out what they're better at that they might not have even known they had inside them.
Well, let me just respond. I appreciate why you were inspired to interrupt, but just one other point I think is important. Look, in 1989, Felice Schwartz wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review. She was the head of Catalyst, which is an organization meant to help women in business. She wanted them to thrive in business. She said maybe we should have 2 kinds of tracks, a career track and a career and family track. And she made it clear that she thought women would be the ones who picked most of the career and family track. Androgynous feminists went crazy. Now, various groups had a joint letter. Betty Friedan was in on it. If you try this, we will sue you. It doesn't matter even if it's a unisex, gender-neutral trap. Women will take most of it. It will be unfair to women. Why don't you instead find out why men aren't doing more of the baby care? Well, I don't know why, but I do know that even though there's all these new men around, if you look at the statistics, there are 58 housewives for every 1 house husband. Even though women, where there's 2 full-time earners, are a third of them, the women are making more than the men. Why aren't more of these women saying to their husband, why don't you take off and be the house husband? I don't know. Something's going on that's not working. 58 housewives for every 1 house husband.
It's because it's women's work. It's not valued by men. They're not going to be jumping at the bit to do it when they're not going to be valued by our society for doing it.
Well, it changes, of course, after 18 months. Suddenly men get more interested. Around the world, men are not interested in the first 18 months. I think it's something about communicating when there's
I would argue there's more diaper changing before
Well, look,
18 months. There's more grunt work.
Here's a study I did. Let me tell you this one. Well, I understand, Claire. I did my own research on this, so I can talk. I said, well, in the new frontier, where would we find it? We'd find it in academia. Let's look at assistant professors who are women and assistant professors who are men, and both have kids under 2. And what do we find? They agree that everybody should do everything equally. They have androgynous ideology. But I have 25 tasks, and the assistant professor females do every one of the 25 more than their husbands, and the husbands do every one of the 25 less than their wives. But then I ask, do you like doing these tasks? And 24 of the 25, how much do you like them? A lot, a little bit, neutral? 24 of the 25, with a baby, the woman assistant professors desperately trying to get tenure say they like doing them more than their husband. 24 of the 25, so what we come up with, and one of them was diaper changing, in which a majority of these women with PhDs trying to get tenure said, I like to change my baby's diapers.
Right. It's one thing to say that you're dissatisfied with your job when your job is going to work and sitting in an office maybe, or teaching classes, or doing any other things that women and men both do. It's another thing to say that you don't like your job as a mother, because people hear that and they say, they hear that as you saying you don't like mothering, you don't like your child, you don't like being a mother. It doesn't surprise me in the least to hear that women report that more than men, because there's more pressure on them to report that more than men.
But they don't say they like getting up at night to take care of the kid. I mean, there's some things they don't like, but they do say they like changing the diaper. And some people who are evolutionary anthropologists say that it might be connected to the fact, that breastfeeding, I don't know whether this is C-SPAN material or not, but it's true. Breastfeeding mothers tend to not find so disagreeable changing a number 2, because apparently it smells a little bit like their own. And but anyway, we've got this problem we've got to do something about.
Respond to that. This is crazy.
I think at this point, there's one more question, and then I think what we'll do is I'll try to wind this up a little bit. Go ahead.
I wanted to know to Mr. Rhoads about the study upon which you seem to place such reliance about the testosterone levels in the uterus. What year were those pregnancies, and how large a sample is that?
I remember it was over 200, and these were, the thing is published in 98, so you're probably talking back in the 70s is when these testosterone levels were taken. Yes.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Go ahead.
Okay. The first thing I appreciate here is that every individual in this room and anyone else who might be in the audience is the inheritor of a social system that's been operating for a good 5,000 years that we know about. Every one of us is here because we had mothers. Every one of them had mothers as well. So the process of evolution itself is an unending progression of womb to womb to womb to womb to womb. To my mind, it doesn't take a study to know there are gender differences, and that the primary natural role of women is to give birth and raise those children. I don't see any information coming out of this discussion that the corresponding natural role of men, boys, would be to support that process. And it doesn't have to mean changing diapers. It can mean financial systems that don't put women in a bind. It could mean valuing the children more than making war. There are a lot of different directions this could go in, but I would like each one of you to comment on why this is a woman's issue and not a cultural issue. Thank you.
I think that's an excellent point. And actually, one of the things that I've really enjoyed about putting together the It's a Boy collection have been these essays, especially by women who are ambivalent about having sons. All of them speak about, of course, coming to realize that babies are babies and they love their babies, and it's not about valuing boy babies over girl babies. But many of them speak about having the opportunity to be a mother to a feminist son, a mother to the kind of son who will grow up and support his wife the way that in some of the ways that you've talked about here. It shouldn't just be a woman's issue. And I hope that as more people share their stories and talk about these things, it won't be.
Just briefly, I think it's a cultural issue. I do think men are less interested in it. That's one of the reasons they flock to my political economy course, but they don't much take the sex differences course. It doesn't put them on the edge of the seat like it does the females, because the females have to make these big decisions, work, family, and so on. But I think the start is saying to men, look, we're different. I know you like casual sex, but there are a lot more 14-year-old depressed girls these days than there used to be, and people who aren't involved in the gender wars at all think it's because there were a lot of cases where these little girls, young women, had sex with guys, and they thought it was a relationship, and he just thought it was sex. And if we don't tell men that women usually react differently to casual sex, then we can't expect them to behave better. If we don't tell men that, I changed my mind about how much I wanted to go back to work, I really am bonded with this kid in a way I didn't expect, but which I think oxytocin helps explain, then the husband's going to say, well, I thought you were going to be a careerist, I was going to be a careerist. And when there's two career people fight over babysitting, this is the typical thing. The mother says, we've been working all week, we got to spend all our time with the kid. The dad says, I've been working all week. Why can't we get a babysitter once in a while? I want to go out to dinner. So these are the splits, I think, that have a natural basis. And I think we'll get a better culture and a more woman-friendly culture if we take these differences seriously. That would be my argument.
Last two. Ellen, you're the last person, okay? No more questions after this. We're going to have to stop. Go ahead.
Just about the very first thing Mr. Rhoads said was that the differences are deep and consequential. And even Andrea said that there's a fundamental otherness about boys. But I think we spent a lot of time focusing on the deep, and then there was this sleight of hand to what the consequences ought to be. And I've been sitting here hoping somebody would ask this question. There's a big move from what is to what ought to be done. And I remember when Title IX was enacted when I was in 9th grade. And of course, I'm sure as a lot of people did, we thought, great, the pie of funding is going to get bigger. And money is a challenging issue, and so the pie got smaller. But thank God that more funding was made available to women so that they had more opportunities. And for goodness sake, healthy, athletically active women might do better bearing children. There's just this big leap that hasn't been addressed between, so they're different. Men tend to be taller than women on average. We have to move the mic up and down for different people who ask questions. But that doesn't mean we should have a global, across-the-board policy that makes it difficult for women who want to behave differently, or difficult for men who want to spend more time at home, and ridicules them for feeling at ease changing diapers if that's what they would like to do as part of being a parent. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, do you want to comment, or we'll get the other one first? A lot of Title IX, I've got a whole chapter on it, only had a little bit of time, but I think that part of our issue is whether competitive cheerleading should count or not, for example. It doesn't, and I think it should. I think there's no reason. It's athletic, it's competitive, there's no reason it shouldn't be counting for Title IX, and the numbers would get closer if it did. But I certainly agree that women should have more opportunities in sports than they did in the 60s and 70s. That's not an issue in the book. And I think you would get more. I mean, part of the problem with stay-at-home dads, let's be frank about this. I ask my female students every year, how many of you would be interested in a stay-at-home husband? None of them ever are.
Have kids yet.
That it doesn't appeal to them. Now, until it does, you're not going to have many stay-at-home husbands.
I'll make my question really quick, but just to give you the biased background where I'm coming from. I'm a 43-year-old female who's been an engineer since I got my degree in '83, worked at a large corporation for a long time where there were very few women working and no women in senior management. Switched into an academic position where it's pretty much the same. I have very few female students, and I'm happy when I do, because they are the ones that are fighting the gender barrier in our field. Still, a lot of these women and also the more senior women that I speak with do mention these comments, such as people asking them, do they have children? Are they married? And things of these nature. I ask my male colleagues if they're ever even asked these questions. For example, I've had situations on job interviews where even though they know it's not appropriate, they're just making conversation at lunch, asking me if I have children and things of this nature. And I just, in listening to this conversation, I wonder how much we really don't look at some of the social construct issues and even of how we deal with professional women who are trying to be in fields that are traditionally non-female fields, and how even people within those fields treat the women in them and make them feel as though they should be focusing more on their motherhood when they're really just trying to hurry up and get those 40 hours in so that they can go home. And I'll stop my question there.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I'm absolutely in favor of opportunities for people like yourself. But I think it's interesting that in 1960, 3% of law schools female, 6% of med schools female. Now it's about 50-50. Biology departments and medicine departments, why is it that females are doing so much better than in engineering and math departments? And I think it might have something to do with the idea that testosterone's connected with spatial skills, and with the fact if you look at 12-year-old girls and 12-year-old boys who are super smart and take the math part of the SAT, there are 13 boys who score above 700 for every one girl. Physics and math are more mathematics than biology and medicine, and they're also medicine. It's a people thing. I think we're going back to that day one, women like people. They want science and people more. Now, I'm not saying you don't, and you aren't really a female, and I want a successful life for you, but I'm not surprised that there aren't as many females in your classes as there are in the biology department.
It also might be, it's true that now medical schools are pretty much 50-50, but that might also be because women have found a way to adapt their careers around what they want to achieve too, and that might be a field where it might be easier to do that. I mean, I know that from firsthand experience, as my husband is a resident right now, we have many friends who are female and in the medical profession. It's very difficult for women to balance family and career, especially in a very hectic career like medicine and surgery specifically. But perhaps that's a field where women can team up and share residencies, as friends of mine have done. They can, for instance, open a practice of a group of women and timeshare their jobs. I mean, women are coming up with all kinds of creative solutions to the problem of career and family, and that, perhaps engineering and these other, fields that you mentioned are just not as easy to finesse in terms of coming up with a creative solution. In other words, I don't think it all just comes down to being about women liking to do one thing and men liking to do another and being better at it.
Okay. Well, it would be kind of hard to wind this up, but obviously there are some divergent views here that, is gender only biologically based, or is it a combination of culture, nurture, and biology, or any or all of the above? I think I kept my mouth shut during this panel. It was really hard, but I'll give myself a pat on the back for that one. But at any rate, I do want to thank to our panelists, both of who, I will get to that too, both of our panelists who spoke today and shared their work with us, and also to all of you in the audience who participated in the conversation. It was very interesting. Please fill out your evaluations and hand them to the folks in the back. And thank you for coming. Have a good afternoon.
Stephen Rhoads and Andrea Buchanan at the 11th Annual Virginia Festival of the Book in Charlottesville. Visit vabook.com for more information.